But one of the good things that you might love about it is pretty simple. This is common sense stuff. When we start talking about ecology and ecosystems, basically I'm going to be giving you words for things you probably already knew were the case. Like I'm going to tell you something about invasive species or endangered species. You're like, oh yeah, I already knew that. Oh, there's a word for it. So I'm hoping that's how this works for you. So here we go. Let's jump into it. This is actually a long chapter. Most likely we won't be able to finish it. And again, whatever we do not finish will not be on the exam. Or maybe I'll have it on there as extra credit for those of you who know how to read a textbook and study without me giving you the lecture. So here we go. The 4 main bullet points that we're going to talk about are biodiversity. Biodiversity. Then we're going to talk about community ecology. Then we're going to talk about ecosystem ecology. Then we're going to talk about conservation and restoration biology. So this one is very much tied up to chapter 19. A lot of these concepts are repeating themselves or maybe adding on to a concept that you already learned in the last chapter. So the first thing we're talking about is biodiversity. Does anybody know what biodiversity is? And this is an important topic. I don't think a lot of people know. I actually got in a conversation with my wife this past, sometime this semester, we got in a conversation about biodiversity, and even my own wife didn't understand its importance. First of all, let's talk about what it is before I get into why it's important. Basically, the most basic way of looking at it, it's the variety of living things. So right now in this classroom, there's me and O'Brien. So and probably some bacteria, maybe a couple of viruses, maybe some protists and some fungi that we can't see, but mostly it's just 2 humans, right? So the biodiversity in this room is very low. Now, if he and I were to step outside and go to the quad or to the doors, in between us and the library, biodiversity would be a lot high. There'd be 2 humans, there'd be some oaks, there'd be some different species of grass, there'd be all the things living in the grass, right? So that's biodiversity. It's the variety of living things. That's the most basic definition. At the very least, understand that before we get into the more detailed explanation of what biodiversity is. The variety of living things. Does anybody have questions about that? All right. Now let's make it a little bit more difficult because that's what we like to do in biology, right? So there are subcategories. If we're talking about the variety of living things, that includes genetic diversity, right? So like I said, right now there's O'Brien and me. That's it in the room. Genetic diversity, I don't know how. We're both Caucasian males. We're both living in the United States. So I don't know. We might not be that genetically diverse. But if you were to add somebody like a female from Asia and then a male from Africa, we'd have more genetic diversity. And even though we're going to talk about this in detail later, I'll go ahead and say it now. When you think about genetic diversity, humans are a great example right now because of COVID. And I've already said this, but some people have died of COVID. Some people didn't, barely even knew they had it. There's a lot of factors in play there, but some of it is genetic. And that's one reason that having genetic diversity is important, because if everybody is genetically the same, then if you have one disease that'll kill somebody, that means it would kill basically the entire population. And of course, I'm using humans as an example because we are humans and we're living in a pandemic, but this is important for more than just that. This is important for every living thing on Earth. So that's genetic diversity. You can see why it would be important to have genetic diversity. The next level up is species diversity. We talked about genetics. Species diversity, that is what it sounds like. And that's the first one I described earlier today when I said there's just 2 humans in this room. That would be species diversity, right? And if he, for some reason, brought in his pet dog, then that means the species diversity would include 2 humans and a dog, right? And then someone else came in, they brought their pet bird. So then we would have 3 humans, a bird, and a dog, right? Species, that's all that means. And then there's ecosystem diversity, and I'm really going to have to come back to that a little bit later. That's hard to give you a good example without fully understanding what it is. Ecosystem is, but just think about the fact like we live in, a forest region in the mountains, right? That's kind of like, that's an ecosystem, right? Our ecosystem is mostly hardwood trees, right? And there's certain animals and plants that live where we live, but they compare that to maybe the Everglades of Florida. They compare that to the deserts of Arizona, right? And compare that to the Pacific rainforest up near Seattle and that area, right? Those are very different ecosystems, and they have very different jobs, so to speak. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But on the same note as the genetic diversity thing, ecosystem diversity is important for that reason too. As things change on Earth, as climate changes and weather changes, and there's a difference between those two, we'll talk about that later, then it's good to have ecosystem diversity, because something might change that would be bad for one ecosystem, and that ecosystem completely fails. But on the other hand, you have this other ecosystem that can thrive under those conditions. So again, it's good to have this diversity. Again, like I said earlier, each one of these is going to be discussed separately, but I wanted to give you that brief introduction. And before I do, I also want to say this. The way your book presents this is a little bit odd. So when we talk about ecosystems, we're talking about all the living things in a given area and how they interact with each other and how they interact with the non-living things. For example, when I say non-living things, if you were to look at the grass that grows next to Hamblin Hall, I bet there's different grass species growing in the part that's constantly in the shadows, right? There has to be a part of Hamblin that's constantly in the shadows because of the way the sun rotates around the Earth rotates around the sun, and the way the sun or the Earth tilts. So I bet there's parts that are mostly sunny, and I bet there's other parts that are mostly shady. And I bet because of that, there's different species of grasses depending on where you look. And that would be an example of how living things interact with non-living things, right? Just one of many examples. Anyway, so that's what an ecosystem is, right? It's how living things interact with each other and the non-living things in that area. What your book really doesn't get into is that ecosystems have jobs to do. We wouldn't be around without it. Now, your book does talk about it. It just doesn't do it right away. But basically, let's just say that we can't survive without ecosystems, right? We need oxygen, we need food, all these things that we get from ecosystems. So that's why biodiversity is important, because without biodiversity, we won't have strong ecosystems. And without strong ecosystems, we just wouldn't exist, right? We couldn't have life without it. A good way to think about it, and I'm just going to use plants as an example because that's the easiest way to think about it. Think about the trees that live, I don't know, in Kanawha State Forest. Or not the trees, all the plants. Those plants are all part of one ecosystem, but they all have many different jobs. Some do very good in high temperatures. Some do very good in low temperatures. Some prefer high pH soil. Some prefer low pH soil. Some prefer a lot of rain. Some prefer a little bit of rain. Some prefer high humidity. Some prefer low humidity. All these different things. All these different plant species thrive in these different conditions. So throughout the year, as the weather and the climate changes and we get these different conditions, at least one of those species is going to be thriving, right? Because they do these different jobs at these different conditions. So that's why we need to have that high species diversity, because all these different species do different jobs in this ecosystem. So anyway, let's jump into it knowing that. That's why this is important. Without biodiversity, ecosystems wouldn't work. And without ecosystems, we would be dead. All right. First thing we're going to talk about is genetic diversity. And I've already given you the overview, so this will be pretty quick. Genetic diversity in a population. Basically, it's the variation in alleles. And for the exam, that's all you need to know, right? It is the variation in alleles.
So that's like the definition.
Yeah, as far as the book is concerned, as far as the exam is concerned, that is the definition. Genetic diversity in a population is basically the variation in alleles. So remember, the alleles are different versions of genes. So if you have high genetic diversity, that means if you were to look at the gene pool of a population, there's all these different alleles, which is good because some alleles could be advantageous in one situation and deadly in another situation. And you know that from the natural selection discussion we had a few weeks ago, right? So having different alleles is good. It's necessary. And again, like we already said, like I just said, those different alleles, that is the raw material that makes microevolution and adaptation possible, right? So again, if you were to use, I don't know, maple trees in the Kanawha State Forest, red maples, that's a species, right? There's going to be there's going to be alleles that are different. And let's say that there's just a handful of maple leaves that happen to do better in, I don't know, slightly cloudier conditions, and the rest of them prefer slightly sunnier conditions. And then let's assume some big volcano goes off in Yellowstone National Park, and then the whole world is covered in clouds, ashes for the next 6 months. Well, because we had some genetic diversity, some of those maples are going to live because those ones that had the alleles that helped them survive thrive in shade as opposed to sunlight, those are the ones that'll make it. That's just an example. Anyway, if a population is lost, right? So the whole population of a species, if the population is lost, obviously the one thing we know is that the number of individuals in a species declines, right? So to remind you the difference between a population and a species. So species is, just the one type of organism, right? So for example, a gray squirrel is a species. That would be a species. The population would be members of the same species that are interacting with each other and sharing the same resources, right? So the gray squirrels of WVSU's campus would be one population. The gray squirrels living in my aunt's yard in North Carolina would be a different population. They're the same species, but they're a different population, right? Because they're not interacting with each other. They're too far apart. So if we lose an entire population, right? So somehow we were to lose all the squirrels on WVSU's campus, then the number of the total gray squirrels obviously would decline. That part's common sense. But more importantly, depending on how you look at it, maybe more importantly, the genetic resources for that species declines, right? Because every time you lose one individual, you are losing genetic resources, right? All the different things, all the different varieties that one individual brought to the gene pool is now gone. And again, that's why biodiversity is so important. And I hate to use the term tree hugger again, but yeah, if you have somebody like me this is one of the reasons I hate cats so much, is because they kill native species that belong here. And then people might say, oh, you're just a tree hugger. Who do you care about the native species? The cat's thriving. Well, that's why. We need genetic resources, right? We need to have those genetic resources for that population to survive. Anyway, so again, if you lose a whole population, or even if you just lose individuals of populations, basically what we're saying here is that decreases the genetic diversity in a population, which puts the whole population at risk, the whole species at risk. So any questions about that? All right, I used the picture of a cheetah down there because that's what we talked about when we talked about microevolution and we talked about the bottleneck effect, right? So the cheetahs went through a near extinction twice in the past, I think it was 100,000 years. So because of that, they are not very diverse. And that's not a good thing, because if there's a disease that could kill one of them, it could probably wipe out the whole population, because most of their alleles are the same. Anyway, your book example for genetic diversity is this: bananas. And your book also points out, gives a real life example of how genetic diversity also has economic value. So again, it's not just this thing of tree huggers. We're like, oh, save the whales because we love whales and whales have intrinsic value. No, that's also economic value, right? There's also money value, which brings us to something called bioprospecting, which is the potential development of new medicines, industrial chemicals, and other products, right? I'm not going to ask you that, but basically what bioprospecting is, it's using genetic diversity to help humans, whether it be with medicines, chemicals, things like that. And the big one, the one that your book is using an example of, is that biodiversity or bioprospecting to increase biodiversity can also save food supplies. And I've already mentioned this thing about bananas before, so now we're going to talk about them again because this is the book definition or the book example. The Cavendish banana. When you go to a store and you buy a banana, that is what you are getting. Notice when you go to a store and you buy oranges or you buy apples, there are different varieties, right? Or grapes, there's all these different varieties. It's not the case with bananas. For bananas, it's just Cavendish bananas. But that has not always been the case. There used to be all kinds of different bananas, but they've all been wiped out. So now, I like how it says virtually all bananas in stores are Cavendish. I guess there might be some exceptions. If there was still independent work, you could look that up and tell me. But as far as we're concerned, all bananas are Cavendish bananas. So here's the thing too. Not only is it all one species, but they are all clones. They are all clones. So every single banana should be genetically identical to every other banana. And that is not a good thing because, again, going back to the humans with the COVID example, some humans have been killed by COVID. Some survive it and barely even knew they had it. Same with flu, right? Flu kills some people. Other people survive it because, amongst other things, we have different genetics. So if there was a disease that wiped out one banana tree, it would probably wipe out the rest of the banana trees because they are all clones of each other. That's the problem. And once this has emerged, one of these diseases has emerged. So these banana trees are going extinct in certain places. So that triggered a search for wild species thought to have no value at one point. So now we're looking at bananas, wild bananas that we've never really cultivated because they were basically useless as food. But now someone figured out, well, hey, even though we can't use them as food, maybe we can use some of their alleles, right? Maybe we can look at their genetics and start crossbreeding these things and put in some diversity into our bananas. So that's it. That's basically what we're saying for bioprospecting. It's a real life example. Bananas are under threat because they're basically clones. They have no genetic diversity. So we're using bioprospecting to hopefully increase the biodiversity and save our banana supply. Another thing too, if you're into dogs, you might notice that purebred dogs, not all of them, but a lot of them, certain breeds have certain problems. And that's usually because in a way, purebred dogs are almost inbred because they're purebred for a reason, right? So there's very little genetic diversity in purebred dogs. So because of that, they have issues that normally wouldn't be around that you probably wouldn't find in a mutt, because mutts are great as far as genetic diversity is concerned. Anyway, any questions about genetic diversity or Cavendish bananas or cheetahs or mutts or purebred dogs? All right, let's bring it up a step then. Now let's talk about species diversities. And again, this kind of segues in as perfectly because remember, like we said, if you lose genetic diversity, then you're going to lose numbers. You might possibly lose an entire species. So that being said, let's talk about species diversity. Before we do, your book points out that we humans are pushing species towards extinction. At the time that this book was printed, the present rate of extinctions is 100 times higher than any time in the past 100,000 years. Basically, what they're saying is we are probably in the middle of a mass extinction. And we're living through it. At the current rate, over 1/2 of all of our plant and animal species may be gone by the end of the century. And I know I posted a video about this from David Attenborough. It's a relatively new video. I don't even think it's a year old yet. And I'll make sure I share that with you guys again soon. But anyway, those aren't numbers that you need to know for the exam. They might be on the study guide, but I'm not going to require you to know them for the exam. Here's some book examples. Your book example is the Hector's dolphin, which is endangered. We don't have time to go into it. You can look into it if you want. That's an endangered dolphin species. Another one is the Formosan clouded leopard, which at the time of the printing of this book, they called it extinct. If I remember correctly, they have since found a couple of individuals. So I don't think it is extinct anymore. I think it is now just endangered again because they were wrong when they called it extinct, if I remember correctly, but I might be wrong. Anyway, some non-book examples, some things I looked up. I wanted to look up a more recent example. So the West African black rhinoceros was a recent one. That's a recent one. That is an extinct species that no longer exists. That has happened within our lifetime. I think within the past 5 or 10 years. I forgot, but it's relatively recently. Another example I picked was passenger pigeon because that's a species from the United States. It was a very large species too, not like the size of the individual, but there was many, many individuals, and we hunted them to death. Then the Carolina parakeet, I think if I remember correctly, that is a species that is extinct in West Virginia, but maybe not all over the region. I don't remember that one. It's been a while since I made this PowerPoint. Please forgive me. But you can look it up if you want to. Any questions about that? Obviously, it's an example, so it won't be on the book, but even more so, it's an example, so it won't be on the exam, but even more so, it's an example that's not from the book, so it's guaranteed to not be on the exam. Anyway, some more information from your book. I'm going to give you some more numbers that you do not need to know for the exam, just giving you an idea of where we are in the situation. About 13% of the 10,004 birds species and about a quarter of the 5,488 mammal species are currently threatened with extinction. Over 20% of freshwater fish have become extinct during human history, or at least severely threatened. About 41% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. And of the about 20,000 plants in the United States, 200 have become extinct, and over 10,000 plant species worldwide are threatened with extinction. So it's a big deal. Again, like I said, we're basically living through a mass extinction. And as I said earlier, and I don't really have time to really harp on it much, we need these species for an ecosystem to thrive, for an ecosystem to work. And why do we need ecosystems? Well, there's the tree hugger answer, which is saying, you know, all living things have intrinsic value, which might be true if you believe that. But more importantly, we need it because we need to survive. So yes, this could be a thing where it's like save the whales because we love whales. But also it's a thing of, hey, you know, things are dying and we can't live without things. And remember, well, I'll get into it later, but you might think, well, we can live without amphibians. I don't particularly need amphibians in my life. But it's not just what you need, it's what the ecosystem needs. And the ecosystem needs all these parts. Even mosquitoes, like we all hate mosquitoes and mosquitoes are deadly. But we need the mosquitoes because mosquito larvae feed fish and fish feed other things, right? It's the whole food web. Anyway, we're done talking about species diversities. Any question about that? All right, the next word for attendance is light bulb. All right, let's move forward and talk about ecosystems diversity. First of all, what is an ecosystem? I already kind of gave you a hint at what it is, but you need to know this for the exam. An ecosystem includes organisms and abiotic factors in a particular area. So like I was saying, it's how living things interact with each other and how they live or how they interact with the non-living things in that area. And again, I was just using the grass on near Hamlin Hall as an example, because I'm sure there are going to be different species depending on where on Hamlin you look because of the different lighting conditions, right? That would be a non-living factor. Or perhaps the different soil conditions, right? There might be different bacteria on one in some soil versus the other. That would be living factors. Anyway, due to interactions among different species, the loss of one species can have a negative effect on an entire ecosystem. Going back to what I keep saying about this whole idea of intrinsic value. Some people say, save the whales because they love whales. And somebody else might be like, well, who cares? Or a more recent example was when we talked about the cheatgrass. Remember, that was an invasive species. So somebody might say, oh, save the native grasses because the cheatgrasses are taking over. And a layman might just say, well, who cares? One grass over the other. They're both grass. They're both plants. What's the problem? But this is the problem, right? If you lose one species, it can have a negative effect on the entire ecosystem. So again, with that cheatgrass, it took over the native species. And it wasn't just the grass that it was affecting because all the native animals and, you know, well, I shouldn't say animals that broadly, but all the herbivores and the mammals and all those different things required, and birds, they all needed that specific native grass. And once you lost that native grass, then you also lost those other species. Anyway, again, like I said, we need ecosystems to survive, right? It's not just a matter of, oh, let's love it because we love nature. No, this is a matter of survival. It's also a matter of economics, which is what the next slide talks about. When I say, ecosystems do things for us, what you need to know is the book definition, or what the book calls it, which is ecosystem services. And you need to know what an ecosystem service is for the exam. Ecosystem services are functions that are performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people. There's a whole long list of them, but your book narrowed it down to 3 examples. Air and water purification, right? Imagine, for example, what it takes to give air to the astronauts on the International Space Station. That costs a lot of money, takes a lot of technology. Here on Earth, we don't have to worry about that. That is one of the ecosystem services we have. Plants and photosynthetic organisms provide us with oxygen. And of course, water purification, but that's a longer story. Climate regulation. We talked about that way back in chapter 2 when we were talking about, this is just one example, but way back in chapter 2 when we were talking about chemistry and we talked about water and how water regulates temperature. And that kind of goes along with it, There's so many studies. There's, Like Charleston on in any given summer day, the city of Charleston is probably going to be noticeably hotter than it is, 3 miles outside of the city in the wooded area, because the wooded area provides a climate regulation. It keeps things cooler. Erosion control. You might notice on I-64 where they're doing all that work off the St. Albans exit, there's a bunch of green stuff. They've blasted off this land. And now it's like exposed dirt, and they sprayed this green stuff. Well, that green stuff is going to turn into plants, specifically grass, because plants provide erosion control. And again, this is just things we need. And also, that would be very expensive to do all that stuff if we didn't have ecosystems doing it for us. Some more examples. Forests absorb and store carbon. Again, there's people are working on technology on how to capture carbon dioxide from the air and store it. It's expensive technology, and it's not that effective. Meanwhile, forests are doing it for free. Coral reefs, they provide food, so that's good. We can't live without food. They provide storm protection. This is important to me. I used to live in the Florida Keys. I still have family that lives there. And as hurricanes hit the reefs, it helps with the storm surge a little bit. So, there's that. And then, of course, there's recreation. And you might think, oh, who cares? Are we really caring about having fun? But it's not just that. In this example, again, if we're talking about coral reefs in the Florida Keys, that's their main source of income, right? Tourism is their source of income. So these ecosystem services are providing basically their entire economy. And again, some of you might think, oh, who cares? That's just the economy of the Florida Keys. Why do I care? Well, think about what happens when you tell West Virginian that we're going to get rid of coal, and then tell them, well, that's just your one source of income for your economy. Maybe you should do something different with your economy. Well, same thing here, right? Anyway, any questions about that? Your book goes into a little bit more detail about coral reefs. Here we go. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. It's just in your book, so I'm providing the information as well. Coral reefs are rich in species diversity, yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans, and 75% are threatened. And that is expected to top 90% by 2030 if the current abuses continue. So basically, it's not a good thing. And then again, your book chose that as an example, but I guess a more valuable example would be if you were to think about the nature in West Virginia, right? We are a coal economy, but we also are a tourist economy. People come here to go whitewater rafting and hiking and to see our parks. And if we were to destroy all that, literally we would lose money. So this is not just a matter of saying, oh, I love the nature and I love species and we should be one with Earth. Kumbaya, right? No, it's not just that. This is also a matter of money. So if you're somebody who only cares about money, then there you go. Any questions about those three types of diversities? And again, you need to know those three different types of diversity for the exam. All right, really quickly, let's talk about the causes of declining biodiversity. We can knock this out. Don't write this down yet because we're going to talk about them separately, but the four main causes, the four main factors, and you need to know them, are habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive species. Hey, we already talked about that, right? So that'll be a review. Over exploitation and pollution. So those are the four things that we're going to talk about. Your book points out that the expanding size / dominance of the human population is basically the cause of all four factors. So in a sense, you could almost say, what is the cause of the declining biodiversity? Well, it's the human population. It's our size and it's our influence, right? Because the human population, the size and the dominance of our human population contributes to these four things that we're about to talk about. Any questions so far? All right. The first one we're going to talk about is habitat destruction. And I like this. This is a big one. And as far as I'm concerned, all the other three, in a sense, fall under habitat destruction. So one question you almost definitely get on the exam is which one is the worst, right? Of the four, which one causes the most damage to the loss of biodiversity? And the answer is habitat destruction. And the way you can remember that, let me back up for a second. The way you can remember that is these other ones kind of fall under that category. If you have an invasive species, the reason it's bad is because it's going to destroy the habitat, right? By outcompeting native resources. If you have over exploitation, that means you're, catching too many fish or cutting down too many trees. How is that bad? Well, you're destroying the habitat. If you have pollution, right? You're killing things with pollution. How is that bad? Well, you're destroying the habitat. So try to keep that in mind. All the other three basically fall under, in a sense, habitat destruction. So try to remember the habitat destruction is the biggest. It is the greatest threat to biodiversity. That's the bullet point right there. That's what you need to know. Where do we get it from? Many sources, but your book listed 4. Agriculture is a big one, right? Humans need to eat. We can't just say stop eating. Urban development, right? Humans need a place to live. Forestry, which is funny because this thing sort of falls under these two because we cut down forests for agriculture. We cut down forests for urban development, right? And of course, mining is a great example because that's what we deal with in West Virginia, right? As a matter of fact, that's what this picture is right here. If you look to the left of this line I'm about to draw, that's a nice, beautiful fall scene, right? All those beautiful trees changing colors. And to the right is mountaintop removal. Anyway, your book gets specific and says that habitat destruction and fragmentation affects over 85% of birds, mammals, amphibians that are threatened with extinction. You do not need to know that number for the exam. Are there any questions about this slide? You don't need to know these examples. What you need to know is that the greatest threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction and fragmentation. What your book doesn't really get into, and what I didn't really discuss, destruction, this part makes sense, right? Because what we've talked about is destruction. What I'm not talking about is fragmentation. And later in the chapter, we'll give some examples of how fragmentation is slightly different than destruction. So just keep that in the back of your mind for now. The next one is invasive species. What you need to know about that, we've already talked about what invasive species are and how they work, but what you need to know in the context of this chapter is that it is the second greatest threat to biodiversity. As you already know, invasive species compete with native species. How do they do that? Well, they prey upon native species, they parasitize native species, they outcompete native species. We've already talked about all that, so I'll leave it at that. Any questions about invasive species? All right, overexploitation. This one's really easy. It's just getting too much, right? Cutting down too many trees, catching too many fish. It's that simple. It's technically, and I guess this is what you need to know for the exam, overexploitation can be from harvesting at rates that exceed the ability of a population to rebound. So you're taking more than can be reproduced. It's that simple, right? You're catching more fish than are being reproduced every year. And then your book gives some examples that you don't need to know, like tigers, bison, Galapagos tortoises. Then your book also gives some plant examples. But anyway, for the exam, you need to know what overexploitation is, right? You're taking more than can be produced. And it is 8:50. So when we come back on Friday, we'll talk about the rest of the stuff. And the last word is going to be tire, like the 4 things that you would have on the wheels of your vehicle. Any questions? All right, make sure you email me with those keywords or wait for the video to come out. I guess that's it. I will be online for office hours, and I'll also be online for lab, just in case you guys have questions about the lab, because I know it might be a little bit complicated. So have a good day.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
Is every lab worth 15 points?
Every lab is worth 20 points.
20 points?
Yeah, 5 for the pre-lab, 15 for the lab, and then the situation like last week where there was no pre-lab, so it was just one big lab, then the whole thing's worth 20 points.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, I'll see you either Friday or during office hours or during lab online if you happen to go there.